to Deep Sleep Stories. Thank you to everyone who's been listening. If these stories help you relax or fall asleep, a short review, comment, or sharing the podcast with someone who might benefit is a simple and meaningful way to support the show so that we may continue to offer it for free. Now, take a slow, gentle breath and let's begin tonight's story.
Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, where you can set down the weight of the day and let your thoughts soften like clouds at dusk. Tonight's tale will follow a quiet old road where blossoms drift like gentle snow, guiding a traveler toward a hidden, peaceful place. Settle yourself in as comfortably as you can. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Rest your hands where they feel most at ease. Take a slow breath in as if you're sipping warm air, and then breathe out as if you're letting a candle's flame steady rather than blow. Again, breathe in and out. Unhurried, unforced. Imagine that the room around you is growing calmer with every exhale. The edges of your worries blur as if they are written in chalk, and the evening mist is gently lifting them from a slate. Your body knows what to do now. Your body can rest. In your mind, picture the beginning of an old country road. It is not a road of urgency. It does not hurry anyone. It is the kind of road that is listened to decades of footsteps and never asked them to be faster. The air there is cool and sweet. Somewhere nearby, unseen branches cradle blossoms, and the petals are loose enough to wander. With each slow breath, you can feel yourself arriving there. You don't need to do anything but listen. You don't need to solve anything. Just let the story carry you like a small boat on a quiet stream. And as your breathing finds its gentle rhythm, the point of view begins to drift, like a petal turning in the air, and the tale can unfold without you needing to hold it. There was an old road that began at the edge of a village and wandered onward as though it had all the time in the world. It was paved with flat stones, smoothed by years of rain, sun, and the soft scuff of shoes. Moss grew between the stones in tender green seams, and in places the earth had risen in little humps, as if the ground beneath were breathing slowly. The villagers called it the Old Road, not because it was forgotten, but because it had the calm dignity of something that had seen many seasons and remained kind. It curved past gardens and hedgerows, then slipped between fields where grasses swayed like a quiet sea. Farther on, the old road entered a grove of trees that leaned together, their branches lacing overhead like the ribs of a protective shelter. In spring, when the first warmth returned and the morning smelled of damp soil and waking leaves, blossoms appeared along that road in a way that felt almost deliberate. They weren't all at once. They came gradually, as if a careful hand were placing them one by one. A pale pink tree stood near the beginning of the grove, and when the breeze moved through it, petals loosened and floated down. They landed on the road in soft scatterings, collecting in shallow dips between stones. A little farther on, white blossoms from another tree drifted like tiny folded notes. Some petals clung to the moss, some rested on the edges of puddles, and some simply kept traveling, skimming along the stones until they found a place that felt right. It was a quiet wonder, and because it asked for nothing, most people received it without question. They walked through blossoms the way one walks through sunlight, accepting it as a gentle gift. But there was one person who noticed the blossoms as though they were speaking. Her name was Elowen, and she lived in a small cottage with a roof the color of weathered clay, and a door painted a soft, faded blue. She had hair the shade of chestnuts and eyes that carried a calm curiosity, like someone who had spent a long time watching the changing sky. Elowen worked in the village as a mender of small things. She repaired torn hems, cracked teacups, broken baskets, and occasionally the delicate hinge of a music box. People brought her items that had been loved, and she gave them a second life with patient hands. Elowen was not in a hurry by nature. She moved carefully, as if each moment deserved to be met properly. And yet, for weeks now, she had felt something like a soft tug in her chest whenever she looked down the old road. It was not an anxious pull. It was not a fear. It was more like a reminder, gentle and persistent, as if someone were whispering her name from a place she could not quite see. One morning, when the village was still quiet and the birds were testing their voices in the hedges, Elowen stepped outside her cottage and breathed in the spring air. The light was pale and clean, and there was a faint scent of blossoms carried on the breeze, even from this distance. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Somewhere down the old road, petals drifted and fell. She could almost hear them, a soft, papery hush that existed more in imagination than in sound. But imagination, Elowen had learned, was sometimes a doorway rather than a distraction. She went back inside, took a woven basket from a hook, and placed a few simple things in it. A warm loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a small tin of honey, a cup, a folded blanket, and a little brass kettle that could be filled at a stream. She hesitated, then added a spool of thread and a needle, as though the road itself might present something that needed mending. When she stepped out again, she pulled the cottage door closed gently, as if not to wake the rooms. She began walking toward the old road, the basket balanced against her hip, her footsteps unhurried. The village watched her go in its own quiet way. A cat on a windowsill blinked slowly. A curtain stirred in a breeze. A baker, arranging rolls in the shop window, paused to rub flour from his hands and glanced at her with a faint smile. No one called out because there was no need. People left sometimes for a walk or a day's wandering and came back with their cheeks warmed by air and their thoughts refreshed. Elowen reached the beginning of the old road and stepped onto the first stone. The difference was immediate. The air here felt cooler, shaded by trees and softened by the damp earth. Even the light seemed to slow down, filtered through branches overhead. Ahead, blossoms drifted. Petals lay on the stones like scattered bits of dawn. When Elowen walked, she did so carefully, not because she feared crushing them, but because she didn't want to break the gentle feeling of the place. She moved as if she were walking through a quiet room where someone was sleeping. The blossoms seemed to guide her, not by forming a path exactly, but by appearing a little thicker in certain places, as though the breeze had preferences. Elowen let herself follow those subtle suggestions, turning where the road curved, pausing when the air felt particularly sweet. After some time, the village sounds disappeared entirely behind her. There were only the steady, comforting noises of nature, the distant call of a bird, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional whisper of the breeze passing through branches. The old road continued into the grove, and as it did, the trees changed. Near the village they had been familiar, oaks and maples and the first blossoming trees of spring. But farther in, the trunks grew smoother and paler, and the leaves above were a deeper green, as if they were older or perhaps more patient. Elowen noticed something else too. The blossoms here did not only fall from branches overhead. Some seemed to drift in from nowhere at all, appearing in the air as if the road itself were exhaling them. They floated slowly, lazily, turning as they fell, catching light along their edges. She reached out and let one land on her palm. It was cool, almost like a snowflake, though it did not melt. Its texture was soft and faintly velvety. For a moment she thought she smelled something far away, like the scent of rain on warm stone, mixed with the sweetness of apple blossoms. Then the petal lifted as if it had changed its mind and drifted away again. Elowen smiled without meaning to. She continued. The old road dipped gently downward and crossed a shallow stream. The water moved over pebbles, making a sound like quiet laughter that never rose to become loud. Elowen knelt, set down her basket, and filled her brass kettle. The water was cold and clear. When she lifted the kettle, droplets ran down its side and fell back into the stream, making tiny rings that expanded and vanished. She sat on a smooth stone beside the stream and unfolded her blanket. She took out the bread and honey, and though she was not particularly hungry, she ate slowly, letting the simple sweetness settle her. Above her, branches swayed, petals drifted down, and landed on the blanket like small, weightless decorations. While she ate, her thoughts did not rush. They wandered gently as if they were strolling along the road beside her. When she finished, she packed the basket again and stood. She felt rested, as though she had been walking for hours, but her body had found a rhythm that did not tire. The old road rose again after the stream, leading into a part of the grove where the trees grew closer together. Their branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel of leaves and blossoms. The air smelled of green things and faint floral sweetness. Light filtered through in soft patches that moved slowly on the stones as the branches swayed. In that tunnel, Elowen heard something new. A sound like bells, but very distant and very small. It might have been wind chimes, or it might have been the way certain leaves touched each other. The sound was so gentle it barely seemed real, yet it carried a quiet invitation. Elowen walked toward it. As she went, the blossoms grew thicker. Petals gathered in little drifts along the edges of the road, like pale, fragrant snowbanks. Some petals stuck to the moss between stones, and some formed little spirals where the breeze had turned. The road itself looked as though it had been decorated for a celebration that no one had announced. Then, just as Elowen rounded a bend, she saw a gate. It was an old wooden gate set into a low stone wall, and the wall was half covered in ivy. The gate was not locked. It was simply closed, as if to mark a boundary rather than to keep anyone out. Blossoms clung to its hinges and rested along the top rail. There was no sign, no warning, no explanation. Elowen approached slowly. When she reached the gate, she noticed that the wood was worn smooth in places, as if many hands had touched it long ago. She placed her palm on the top rail. It felt cool and steady, and in that moment she felt the gentle tug in her chest become a little clearer, like a song coming into focus. She lifted the latch. The sound it made was soft, a quiet click that seemed to settle into the air, like a pebble dropped into water. The gate swung inward without effort. Beyond it, the old road continued, but it changed. The stones were lighter in color here, almost as if they had been washed and polished. The blossoms were everywhere, drifting in slow motion, and the air held a faint shimmer, like the space between heat and shade. Elowen stepped through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the sound of the grove shifted. It did not become louder or stranger. It became softer, as if someone had placed a gentle hand over the world to quiet it. Even the bird song seemed farther away, more like a memory than a presence. She looked back once, expecting perhaps to see the gate behind her. It was there, exactly as it had been, but the road behind seemed slightly dimmer, as if she were looking at it through a thin veil of mist. Elowen turned forward again and continued. The old road now wound through a landscape that felt familiar and not familiar at the same time. The trees were shaped like those she knew, but their leaves had a subtle silver sheen. The blossoms drifting down were pink and white and sometimes a pale gold, and they carried scents that reminded Elowen of different seasons all at once. Spring rain, summer sun, autumn apples, winter smoke from a hearth. She walked, and as she did, the gentle bell-like sound returned, clearer now. It seemed to come from ahead, from somewhere the road was leading. The path widened slightly, and the trees opened into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a house. It was not large, but it had the kind of presence that made it feel important. It was built of smooth, pale wood, with a roof of dark shingles. Vines climbed its walls, and blossoms hung in clusters around its windows. A small chimney rose from one side, and a thin ribbon of smoke drifted upward, curling lazily into the branches above. The house looked as though it had been waiting. Elowen approached, her steps slow. The clearing was quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt held, like a bowl holding water. Near the front door there was a low stone bench. and on the bench sat a small round object. Elowen leaned closer and saw that it was a bell. Not a large bell, but a delicate one made of pale metal. It had a handle shaped like a twisted branch, and it was dusted with petals, as though blossoms had been resting there for some time. Elowen did not touch it. Instead, she stood before the door and listened. From inside the house came the faint sound of movement, like someone setting down a cup. A moment later, the door opened. A person stood there, if person was the right word. They were shaped like a person with 2 hands and a face and hair, but their presence felt like the quiet of twilight. Their hair was long and silver black, falling over their shoulders like a smooth river. Their eyes were a soft, gray-green, like the underside of a leaf. They wore simple clothes, a long, light tunic, and a shawl that looked as though it had been woven from mist. They smiled at Elowen, and the smile carried no surprise, as if they had known she would come. "Welcome," they said, their voice low and calm. It was a voice that made the air feel warmer. "You followed the blossoms." Elowen nodded, though her throat felt suddenly tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. "I did," she replied softly. "I didn't know where they would lead." "Few do," the figure said, "but the road remembers those who listen." Elowen glanced at the house, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the blossoms drifting down. "Where am I?" she asked. The figure's gaze moved briefly to the old road behind her, then returned. "You are in a place that sits beside your world," they said. "A quiet fold in it, a resting place for things that need time, for stories that wish to be heard slowly." Elowen's basket suddenly felt heavy, as if it had carried more than bread and honey. "Who are you?" she asked, though the question felt less important than the feeling in her chest. The figure tilted their head slightly. "Some call me the Keeper of the Blossoms," they said. "Others call me the Listener. Names are like petals. They drift, they land, they move on." Elowen found herself breathing more deeply, as if the air here made it easier. "Why did the blossoms call to me?" she asked. The keeper's smile softened. "Because you mend," they said simply, "and because you know how to be gentle with what is broken. The road has many small things that need that kind of care." Elowen looked down at the petals gathering on the stones. "What kind of things?" she asked. The keeper stepped aside, holding the door open. Warm air drifted out, carrying the scent of tea and something sweet like baked pears. "Come in," they said. "You can see." Elowen stepped into the house. Inside, the light was soft and golden, as though it had been filtered through honey. The room was simple but inviting. A small hearth glowed with low firelight. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with books exactly, but with small objects: a cracked porcelain bird, a ribbon faded with age, a tiny wooden horse with one missing ear, a key that looked too delicate to open any ordinary lock. There were jars filled with petals, each jar labeled not with words but with little symbols: a spiral, a star, a wave, a leaf. A kettle simmered quietly near the hearth. A table stood in the center with 2 cups and a teapot. A window looked out onto the clearing, where blossoms drifted like slow rain. Elowen felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, as if she had stepped into a place her body recognized, even if her mind did not. The keeper gestured toward the table. "Sit," they said. Elowen sat, placing her basket beside her chair. The wooden seat was smooth and warm. She rested her hands on the table and noticed that the surface was marked with faint scratches, like the traces of many conversations. The keeper poured tea. The liquid was pale gold, and when it filled the cup, it released a fragrance that reminded Elowen of sunlit fields and quiet afternoons. Elowen lifted the cup and took a sip. The tea tasted like warmth itself. It spread through her chest and loosened the tightness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The keeper sat across from her, hands folded, watching her with calm attention. "What are these things?" Elowen asked, nodding toward the shelves. The keeper's gaze followed hers. "They are small pieces of lives," they said. "Small fragments of moments that were loved, then lost. When people forget them completely, they drift. They find their way to the old road, and the blossoms catch them so they do not fall into nothing." Elowen's eyes moved over the objects again. She felt a gentle ache, not painful but tender. "So this is where forgotten things go," she whispered. "Not all forgotten," the keeper corrected softly. "Sometimes they are remembered, but the remembering is too heavy, or the remembering is tangled. Sometimes the object holds a feeling, and the feeling needs to rest somewhere safe." Elowen thought of the item she had mended in the village, the way people's faces softened when they held a repaired cup or a stitched sleeve. "And what do you do with them?" she asked. "I keep them," the keeper said. "I listen to them. I let them be held until they are ready to return, or until they become something else." Elowen frowned slightly, her mind moving slowly, like a river under ice. "Become something else?" The keeper reached toward one of the jars on the table. Elowen hadn't noticed it before. Inside were petals that shimmered faintly as though they carried light in their veins. The keeper held the jar gently. "Blossoms are not only blossoms here," they said. "They are also carriers. They carry stories. They carry small comforts. They carry the feeling of being safe on an old road." Elowen's fingers tightened around her cup. "So the blossoms, they're like messages," she said. "In a way," the keeper replied. "They drift where they are needed." Elowen looked down into her tea. The surface reflected the warm light of the hearth, and for a moment she thought she saw something else there. An image of the old road, stretching long and calm, covered in petals. "Why did I feel called?" she asked again, quieter now. The keeper's eyes were steady. "Because you have been carrying your own small sadness," they said, not as an accusation but as a gentle observation. and because you have been mending everyone else's things without letting yourself be mended. Elowen's breath caught softly. She didn't deny it. She didn't need to. The truth of it was as simple as the warmth of the tea. The keeper continued, voice like a soft blanket being pulled over a sleeping child. There was a time, they said, when you walked the old road as a girl. Do you remember? Layla's mind drifted back, unbidden. A memory rose slowly, like a leaf floating to the surface of water. She was younger, her hands smaller, her laughter louder. She remembered running along the old road, chasing petals with her friend Mira with her bright eyes and quick feet. They had pretended the blossoms were tiny boats, and they had made wishes on each one. Mira. Layla's chest tightened again, but this time the feeling was not sharp. It was soft, like pressing a bruise that is already healing. Mira had left the village years ago, drawn by a restless need to see beyond the fields. She had promised to return, and for a while she had sent letters full of sketches and stories. Then the letters had stopped. Not with a farewell, but with silence. Elowen had waited, then waited differently, and learned to carry the waiting like a stone in her pocket. She had told herself she was fine. She had filled her days with work and mending, with kindness and routine. She had become reliable, steady, and somewhere inside, a part of her had remained on the old road with blossoms falling and a friend laughing beside her. The keeper watched Elowen's face with quiet understanding. The old road remembers your wishes, they said. It remembers the day you made one for your friend to always find her way home. Layla swallowed. I did, she whispered. I forgot I had. You didn't forget, the keeper corrected gently. You tucked it away so it wouldn't hurt to hold. Layla sat very still. The fire crackled softly. Outside the window, petals drifted down in slow spirals. The keeper reached to a shelf and took down a small object, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. It was tied with a thin ribbon that had faded from red to soft rose. They placed it on the table between them. Layla stared at it. Her fingers hovered, hesitant. It came down the road, the keeper said. Caught by blossoms. It has been resting here. Layla's heart beat slowly, heavily, as if each beat was taking its time. Is it? She began. The keeper nodded once. Layla reached out and touched the paper. It felt delicate, as though it might crumble, but it held together, held by something more than fibers, held by care. She untied the ribbon slowly, as if she were unwrapping something sacred. She unfolded the paper. Inside was a drawing, a quick sketch of the old road with blossoms falling. Two small figures stood beneath a tree, one with chestnut hair, one with hair like dark ink. Above them, in looping handwriting, were a few words. Layla read them, and her eyes blurred with quiet tears. The words were simple. They did not explain the years of silence. They did not offer a grand story. They were only this: a promise that had taken a long time to travel. Mira had written that she had lost her way for a while, lost it in the noise of the world and her own racing thoughts. She had carried guilt, and the guilt had made her avoid the path back. But she had never forgotten the old road. She had never forgotten Elowen. And lately, she had been dreaming of blossoms drifting down stones, as if the road itself were calling her home. Elowen's tears fell onto the paper, but the ink did not run. The drawing remained clear, steady. The keeper watched her cry as one might watch rain, not trying to stop it, simply allowing it to fall and pass. Elowen took a slow breath. The sadness in her chest shifted. It loosened slightly like a knot being gently worked apart. "She's coming back?" Elowen whispered. The keeper's expression was peaceful. "The road is guiding her," they said. "The blossoms know where to drift." Elowen closed her eyes for a moment and let that truth settle into her body. She could feel the years of waiting soften, not disappearing, but becoming lighter, less sharp around the edges. The keeper reached across the table and with a careful fingertip lifted one of Elowen's tears from the paper as though it were a bead. They touched it to a petal from the shimmering jar. The petal absorbed the tear. It glowed faintly, then drifted upward, as if buoyed by invisible air. Elowen watched, entranced. The petal floated toward the window and slipped through a crack that had not been there before. Outside it joined the other blossoms, drifting down the old road. "What was that?" Elowen asked, voice hushed. "A message," the keeper said, "not of words, of feeling, of release." Elowen's shoulders relaxed. Her breathing became slower, deeper. The keeper poured more tea. "You don't have to carry everything," they said quietly. "Even menders need rest." Elowen nodded. She felt as though she had stepped into a rhythm older than her own life, a rhythm of roads and seasons and returning. They sat together for a long time, not speaking much. The silence was not empty, it was full of warmth. The firelight moved softly on the walls. The shelves of small objects seemed to breathe, as though each one was resting peacefully. After a while, the keeper stood and walked to a cabinet. They opened it and took out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. They brought it to Elowen and placed it in her hands. The cloth was soft, patterned with tiny blossoms. Elowen unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a spool of thread, silver thread finer than anything she had ever seen. It shimmered like moonlight on water. Elowen looked up, surprised. "For mending what can't be mended with ordinary thread," the keeper said. "For stitching together the soft places inside. For repairing the seam between holding on and letting go." Elowen's fingers trembled slightly as she touched the thread. It felt cool, alive, as though it carried a quiet hum. "I don't know how to use this," Elowen admitted. The keeper smiled. "You already do," they said. "Not with your hands alone, with your attention. With your gentleness, Alawan held the spool against her palm and felt its lightness. It did not weigh her down. It felt like possibility. Outside, blossoms continued to drift. The bell-like sound returned, faint and lovely, like distant wind chimes. "It's time to go back," the keeper said softly, as if they were suggesting sleep rather than departure. "Not because you are unwelcome, but because the road is part of the mending. You will walk it differently now." Alawan stood slowly, as though she were waking from a pleasant dream. She placed the silver thread carefully into her basket, beside her needle and spool of ordinary thread. She tucked the letter drawing safely in cloth. At the door, she paused. "Will I see you again?" she asked. The keeper's eyes were kind. "Whenever you follow the blossoms with a quiet heart," they said. "Whenever you remember that rest is also a form of repair." Alawan stepped outside. The clearing was unchanged, but it seemed brighter, as if the air itself had been warmed by something gentle. She walked back toward the gate, and the blossoms seemed to drift around her with soft familiarity. A petal landed on her shoulder and stayed there like a tiny blessing. When she reached the gate, she glanced back once more. The house stood peacefully in the clearing, smoke curling from its chimney. The keeper stood in the doorway, a still silhouette among drifting petals, like a figure made of twilight. Alawan stepped through the gate. The world shifted again, becoming more like her own. The sounds of birds grew clearer. The air smelled less like many seasons at once and more like spring earth and blossoms. The old road stretched ahead, still covered in petals. Alawan began walking toward the village. As she walked, she felt the gentle tug in her chest change into something else. It was still a pull, but now it felt like a warm thread drawing her forward, not dragging, not demanding, just guiding. The stream appeared again, laughing softly over pebbles. Alawan paused there, not to drink this time, but simply to watch the water. She noticed how it moved around stones without struggle. It did not fight, it flowed. It found its way. She crossed the stream and continued. The blossom tunnel welcomed her back, branches arching overhead. Petals drifted down, and she no longer wondered if they were random. She felt their quiet intention, their gentle companionship. When she emerged from the grove, she could see the village in the distance, roofs nestled like resting animals against the earth. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent again. Alawan's steps were slow. She was not rushing to arrive. She was letting the road do its work. By the time she reached her cottage, the light had softened into late afternoon. She opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of wood and herbs greeted her. Everything was as she had left it. Yet it felt different, as if the rooms had been waiting to hold her in a new way. She set down her basket and hung her cloak. Then she moved to the window and looked out. The old road was visible from here, just beyond the village gardens. Even from this distance, she could see a faint flutter of petals along its edge. Elowen placed a hand on the glass and felt her breath slow. In the days that followed, she returned to her work, mending hems and cups and baskets. But she did it with something extra now, a softness toward herself, a willingness to pause. When her hands grew tired, she rested them. When her mind wandered to old worries, she breathed and let the worries drift like blossoms. And sometimes when she threaded her needle, she found herself reaching not for ordinary thread, but for the silver spool. She used it carefully, almost reverently, stitching tiny invisible seams in the places that felt tender. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars began to appear, Elowen heard a knock at her door. She opened it, and there stood a traveler, dust on their boots and a pack slung over one shoulder. Their hair was dark ink, their eyes bright with tired hope. Mira. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them held years of absence, years of unspoken things. But the air also held blossoms, even if none were visible. It held the quiet work of the old road. Mira's mouth trembled into a small, uncertain smile. "I followed something," she said softly. "I don't know what. It felt like petals." Elowen's eyes filled again, but the tears were warm, not sharp. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her friend. Mira held her tightly, as if afraid she might vanish. They stood like that for a long time, breathing together, letting the years settle gently into place. No anger rose, no harsh words were needed. The road had already carried the hardest parts. The blossoms had softened the edges. Inside the cottage, Elowen lit a lamp. She warmed bread and poured tea. Mira sat at the table, her shoulders finally dropping, her face relaxing as if she'd been holding herself stiff for too long. They talked quietly, not forcing every story out at once. Some things could wait. Some things could be held gently, like fragile objects on a shelf. And when the evening grew late and Mira's eyelids began to droop, Elowen brought out a blanket and tucked it around her friend like a tender gesture of forgiveness and homecoming. Outside, the village slept. The old road lay quiet beyond the gardens, still catching petals in its mossy seams. The story begins to slow now, like a lullaby, fading into softer notes. The cottage is warm, the lamplight is dim, the air is calm and still. Mira sleeps, breathing evenly. Elowen sits nearby for a while, listening to the gentle rhythm of that breathing, feeling her own breath match it. Beyond the window, the night is deep and kind. Somewhere in the grove, blossoms drift down onto the old road. They land softly on stone. They settle into moss. They rest. The road holds them without hurry. Elowen's eyes grow heavy. Her shoulders loosen. Her hands rest in her lap, relaxed and warm. If there are any thoughts still moving in the mind, they can slow down now, like leaves floating to the shore. They don't need to go anywhere. They can simply be, breathing in and out, in and out, world is quiet, the heart is quiet, the body is safe, and as the blossoms drift and the old road keeps its gentle watch, sleep can arrive like a soft blanket, settling over everything with ease. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well.